Imagine a young woman called to a life-threatening mission in the heart of an empire that could crush her with a mere gesture. This is the story of Esther, a queen chosen by God to save her people from certain destruction. Today, we'll dive deep into Esther's life, discovering how her courage and faith shaped the fate of many and how these lessons still resonate with us. Stay with us to uncover the divine secrets and strategies hidden in the life of this incredible woman of God. Esther's story is one of the most powerful and transformative narratives in the Bible. It's no wonder the book of Esther is celebrated as a tale of courage and divine providence. Esther, a young Jewish woman, found herself in a position of influence not by chance, but as part of a greater plan. Her path to the throne of Persia as the wife of King Xerxes seemed unlikely to human eyes. Yet, the invisible hand of God was guiding each event. It leads us to reflect, how often do we find ourselves in places where we think we don't belong, not realizing we are there to fulfill a divine purpose? From the beginning, Esther's fate is marked by circumstances that seem ordinary, yet carry the signature of God. Mordecai, her cousin and guardian, advises her not to reveal her Jewish origin, a counsel that later proves crucial. This detail makes us consider how sometimes silence is necessary until the right moment to act. The book of Esther teaches us that silence can be a powerful tool when paired with wisdom. Have you ever thought about how God might be preparing you in silence for a bigger moment? Reading the book of Esther, from chapter 1 to 10, we can see how God moves behind the scenes, even when His name isn't explicitly mentioned. This lesson impacts me deeply, as often in our own lives, we feel God is distant when, in fact, He is orchestrating everything. This brings hope because we know that even when we don't see Him, He is present. How many times have we felt that God was absent, but looking back, realized He was there all along? Esther's selection as queen was not just a whim of fate. She was chosen not just for her beauty but for a greater purpose. This makes me think about how we are often chosen for roles that seem challenging. Esther reminds us that even in moments of fear, we are called to stand up and trust in God's purpose for our lives. Are we ready to, like Esther, risk our lives and trust in God at the right moment? When Haman, the enemy of the Jews, devises a plan to exterminate God's people, it is through Esther's courage that the story changes. She fasted, prayed, and prepared before speaking to the king, teaching us that before any significant action, we should seek God's direction. How many times do we act without consulting God, and how many blessings do we miss because of that? Esther's story teaches us that spiritual preparation is as important as the courage to act. Esther invites us to reflect on our own life and spiritual journey. Perhaps, like her, we are called to critical moments, for such a time as this, Esther 4 verse 14. Her story challenges us to consider, are we willing to stand up and act, even when the risk is great? This is a question that deeply resonates with me, and should echo in our hearts. Are we ready to fulfill our calling, even when everything is at stake? Esther, whose original name was Hadassah, had a childhood marked by the pain of loss. Orphaned at a young age, she was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who cared for her like a daughter, Esther 2 verse 7. Her story begins in simplicity, and perhaps even obscurity, but God was already preparing the way for something greater. What strikes me is how God chooses seemingly ordinary people to accomplish great deeds. How often do we feel insignificant, not realizing we are being prepared for something extraordinary? Esther's life changes dramatically when King Xerxes decides to seek a new queen to replace Vashti. The selection process, as described in the book of Esther, chapter 2, was rigorous and involved many beautiful and noble women. However, Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her, Esther 2 verse 15. I believe this was not due to her appearance alone but to something much deeper, her humility and God's grace. She did not seek to stand out, but was distinguished by divine favor. When Esther is finally crowned queen, there's a profound lesson for us. God, in His wisdom, positions her in a place of influence at the exact moment her people would face a deadly threat. Often, we wonder why certain doors open or why we are led to unexpected situations. Esther's story reminds us that God places us in strategic positions to fulfill His will, even when we don't understand at the moment. A point that deeply touches me is how Mordecai advises Esther not to reveal her Jewish origin, Esther 2 verse 10. This shows Mordecai's wisdom and Esther's obedience. Sometimes, silence is necessary until the right moment to act. God, in His sovereignty, knows the perfect time to reveal our purposes and use them for the greater good. Are we ready to hear God's voice and act at the right time, just as Esther did? Esther's rise to the throne of Persia was not just a fairy tale, but a journey of faith and trust in God. She was prepared, both by Mordecai and by the circumstances, to become an instrument in God's hands to save His people. Reflecting on this story, I often wonder how often we underestimate the plans God has for us, without realizing that He is working behind every event in our lives. Esther teaches us to trust in divine providence, even amidst uncertainty. The Persian Empire, where Esther's story unfolds, was one of the largest empires of antiquity, spanning vast territories and diverse cultures. Under the rule of King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, centralized power was absolute, yet it coexisted with a vast diversity of peoples. The Jews, living in exile after the fall of Jerusalem, were a captive people but maintained their faith and identity amidst oppression. This setting makes me reflect on how God, even in unfavorable circumstances, preserves His people, as seen in Jeremiah 29 verse 11, which reminds us of God's plans for peace and prosperity. Exile brought profound challenges for the Jews, especially in maintaining their faith in a pagan environment. In the Persian Empire, the worship of various gods and political life were marked by intrigue, lust, and ambition. Esther's story takes place in this setting where the laws of the Persians were inflexible, Esther 1 verse 19, and the king was viewed almost as a god. This highlights the contrast between the court culture and the simple, devout faith of the Jews. I wonder how difficult it was for God's people to maintain their identity, yet they remained faithful. Another important aspect of the cultural and political context is the absolute power of the king. The royal decree was irrevocable, a unique feature of Persian law, Esther 8 verse 8. This creates a sense of tension in the book of Esther, as once Haman managed to approve the order to exterminate the Jews, there seemed to be no way out. However, even in the midst of this uncertainty, God was preparing the stage for liberation. Esther's story shows us that, even when political forces seem immutable, God is greater than any king or decree. The role of women in the Persian Empire was submissive and often undervalued, as seen in the case of Queen Vashti, who was deposed for disobeying the king, Esther 1 verse 12. However, Esther, with her wisdom and courage, subverts this expectation, showing that a woman could be the instrument of salvation for a people. This leads me to think about how God uses whom He wishes, regardless of cultural or political limitations. Esther, a Jewish woman, was chosen by God to be in the right place at the right time. The political context also highlights the anti-Semitism represented by the figure of Haman, who harbored a deep hatred for the Jews and sought to exterminate them, Esther 3 verse 6. Political intrigue and the quest for power were at the center of many actions in Susa, the Persian capital. Yet, God's providence prevailed, showing that no evil scheme can thwart divine plans. Reading this part of the story, I am inspired by how God reversed the situation, reminding us that even amidst conspiracies, He is faithful to save His people. Esther's strategic wisdom is one of the most striking features of her story. When Mordecai advises her to keep her Jewish identity secret, Esther 2 verse 10, she obeys, demonstrating sensible intelligence and deep trust in his leadership. Esther knew the right time to reveal who she was had not yet come. This makes me think about how often we are called to act with caution and discernment, waiting for the right moment to speak or act, as guided by God. When the threat against the Jews arises through Haman's decree, Esther does not act impulsively. Instead, she calls on Mordecai and all the Jewish people to fast for 3 days before approaching the king, Esther 4 verse 16. Here, we see her spiritual strategy. Before any political move, she seeks divine direction. This point touches me deeply, as we often underestimate the power of prayer and fasting in times of crisis. Esther teaches us that true power first comes from dependence on God. Another clear example of her wisdom is how she approaches the king. Knowing she could not just enter and make her request, Esther prepares a banquet and invites the king and Haman, Esther 5 verse 4. This action not only creates a favorable environment but also demonstrates patience and political intelligence. She knows the time to reveal her identity and expose Haman's plan was not yet. Esther's wisdom in waiting for the right moment makes me reflect on the importance of prudence and strategy in our own decisions. At the second banquet, Esther finally reveals her identity to the king and exposes Haman's evil plan, Esther 7 verses 3-6. The timing was perfect. She knew that at that moment, the king was emotionally involved and predisposed to listen to her request. This is a classic example of how God equips His chosen ones with wisdom to face challenges. The way Esther orchestrated the events reminds us that God gives us discernment to act at the right time, and that is what can change history. Esther's wisdom is not only in her immediate actions but also in her discernment to follow advice. By listening to Mordecai, and by acting with caution and faith, she saved her people. This point makes me think about how important it is to be teachable, seeking wisdom from both God and trusted spiritual leaders. Esther shows us that wisdom is not just acting intelligently but also knowing when to listen and wait for the right moment to act according to God's will. Haman's plot against the Jews is one of the darkest twists in the book of Esther. Haman's wounded pride, caused by Mordecai's refusal to bow to him, Esther 3 verse 5, leads him to devise a plan to annihilate all the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. The depth of Haman's hatred reminds us how pride can corrupt and generate unimaginable tragedies. When I read this part of the story, I wonder how often we allow pride to blind us, leading us to seek revenge instead of acting with compassion and humility. Haman's plan is indeed terrible and effective, as he manages to convince King Xerxes to issue a decree of extermination, Esther 3 verses 8 to 10. Jews throughout the empire are suddenly faced with the possibility of imminent death, with no apparent way out. This moment of crisis reflects many moments in the history of God's people, where everything seemed lost. Yet, we know that God's hand was working behind the scenes, even when the situation seemed hopeless. Esther's story teaches us to trust in God, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Mordecai's role is crucial at this moment of crisis. He not only feels the weight of the situation but also takes immediate action, such as tearing his clothes and putting on sackcloth as a sign of mourning and prayer, Esther 4 verse 1. More importantly, he approaches Esther and challenges her to use her position as queen to intercede for the Jewish people. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4 verse 14 is the question Mordecai asks, one of the most powerful verses in the book. This phrase makes me think about how God positions us to act in critical moments, and whether we are prepared to answer the call. Esther's dilemma is real. She knows that approaching the king without being summoned could result in her death, Esther 4 verse 11. However, the gravity of the situation requires her to risk her life for the sake of her people. This moment of tension, when Esther decides to fast and pray before approaching the king, reflects a choice we all face at some point, between personal comfort and the courage to do what is right. Esther's courage deeply inspires me, as it shows us that in times of crisis, faith in God can empower us to face even the greatest risks. Ultimately, Haman's decree makes us reflect on the power of institutionalized injustice. With a simple decree, an entire nation was on the brink of extinction. However, Esther's story reminds us that even when injustice seems unbeatable, God can reverse any situation. This leads me to believe that although evil may seem to prevail for a time, God's justice always finds a way to triumph. Haman's evil plan was in motion, but God had already prepared the way for salvation through Esther. Esther's plan was courageous from the start, and each step was carefully calculated. When she decided to approach the king unsummoned, she risked her life, as this was an offense that could result in death, Esther 4 verse 11. However, Esther did not act impulsively. She fasted and prayed, seeking divine wisdom before taking any step. Her courage impresses me deeply, as it teaches us that in the face of great challenges, the first step is to seek God. She trusted that the Lord would guide her, even when danger was imminent. Esther's strategy of inviting the king and Haman to a series of banquets was brilliant. Instead of rushing her request, she creates an atmosphere of trust and favor with the king, Esther 5 verses 4 to 8. This makes me think about the importance of timing in our own lives. Esther could have revealed her identity at the first banquet, but she waited for the right moment. She teaches us the importance of patience and discernment, even when we are anxious to resolve a crisis. Often, God gives us the wisdom to wait for the perfect moment to act. The second banquet was the turning point. Esther finally reveals her true identity to the king and Haman's evil plan to destroy her people, Esther 7 verses 3 to 6. The impact of this revelation was huge, and she risked everything, including her position as queen, to save the Jews. Esther's courage is a powerful example of how faith in God can give us the strength to speak the truth, even when the risk is high. She trusted that God was with her, and this makes me reflect on how often we are afraid to act, forgetting that the Lord is by our side. By exposing Haman in front of the king, Esther also shows us the importance of confronting injustice directly. She did not hesitate to expose the evil that was about to happen, placing the life of her people in the hands of God and the king. This reminds me of Proverbs 31 verses 8 to 9, which encourages us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Esther's plan was not just a matter of strategy, but an act of justice. She inspires us to be courageous and to fight for what is right, even when the price is high. The outcome of Esther's plan was a victory for the Jewish people, but the path there was marked by risk, patience, and faith. The story teaches us that even when we face impossible situations, God gives us the tools and the courage to act. Esther's courageous plan is a reminder that in moments of darkness, the light of faith and the wisdom of God can guide us. How often do we avoid making difficult decisions for fear of the consequences, not realizing that God has already prepared the way for our victory? The reversal of Haman and Mordecai's fortunes is one of the most dramatic in the Bible. Haman, full of hatred and arrogance, planned to eliminate Mordecai and all the Jews, even building a gallows to hang his rival, Esther 5 verse 14. However, Haman's fate changed completely when King Xerxes discovered the truth through Esther. What impresses me about this passage is how God reverses situations that seem irreversible, showing that His justice always prevails, even when evil seems to have the advantage. Haman is forced to honor Mordecai in a way he never imagined, leading him in a public parade through the city, dressed in royal clothes and riding the king's horse, Esther 6 verse 11. The irony of this situation reveals how God can turn the tables in surprising ways. Haman, who sought to humiliate Mordecai, is the very instrument of his exaltation. This passage makes me reflect on divine justice, which often manifests in ways we cannot foresee, but always reveal the sovereignty of God. In the climax of this reversal, Haman is hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai, Esther 7 verse 10. The symbol of his planned victory becomes the instrument of his own destruction. This makes me think about how the evil we intend against others can turn back on ourselves. Proverbs 26 verse 27 warns us, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them." Haman's story is a powerful reminder that arrogance and injustice never triumph in the end. After Haman's downfall, Mordecai is elevated to a position of honor in the kingdom, receiving the royal ring that belonged to Haman and assuming his position of influence, Esther 8 verse 2. The man who was on the verge of death now becomes the second most powerful man in the kingdom. This makes me think about how God transforms the fortunes of the righteous, even when all seems lost. The reversal of Mordecai's fate is proof that, in God's hands, even the most desperate circumstances can be turned around for good. The story of Esther and Mordecai reminds us that God's justice never fails. When we trust in Him, we can be assured that, in the right time, evil will be defeated and the righteous will be exalted. This reversal in the fortunes of Mordecai and Haman is a clear example of how God acts in favor of His people. Sometimes, victory may seem distant, but Esther's story teaches us that God is always in control, turning fate in favor of his own, even when all seems lost. The issuance of a new decree, under Mordecai's direction, was key to the salvation of the Jewish people. The original decree of Haman, which ordered the extermination of the Jews, could not be revoked due to Persian law, but with the king's permission, Mordecai found a solution. He drafted a new decree, allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies, Esther 8 verse 11. This action shows the importance of wisdom and strategy. Often, the solution isn't to eliminate the problem immediately but to find ways to handle it within the circumstances that God allows. The permission for the Jews to defend themselves was a crucial turning point. Before this, they were doomed to certain death. Now, with the new decree, they could not only resist but also had the official support of the king. This radical change in the fate of God's people shows how, in desperate situations, God not only delivers us but also strengthens us to face our enemies. I am impressed with how God turns the scenario in our favor, ensuring that his justice prevails, even when all seems lost. The impact of this new decree was immense. The fear of Haman and his allies spread, and many even converted to Judaism, Esther 8 verse 17. This reminds me of the transformative power of God in times of crisis. Sometimes, it is in the most difficult situations that the testimony of God's people shines most brightly. The story of Mordecai and Esther not only ensured the survival of the Jews but also demonstrated the power of divine providence. What seemed to be a decree of death became an opportunity for the glory of God to be revealed. Mordecai's action also teaches us an important lesson about leadership. He did not just passively wait for God's intervention but acted according to the wisdom he received. Sometimes, we are called to do the same, not just wait for miracles but act with the courage and direction that God gives us. The new decree not only preserved the lives of the Jews but also empowered them to fight for their own survival. This reminds us that, with God by our side, we have the strength to face any adversity. Finally, the victory of the Jews, under the new decree, was complete. They prevailed against their enemies and established a day of celebration that would be remembered for generations, Esther 9 verses 17 to 19. This victory was not just physical but spiritual. The story of Esther and Mordecai is a testimony that when we trust in God and act with wisdom, he turns our battles into victories. For me, this is a message of hope. Even when everything seems against us, God always prepares the way for our redemption and triumph. If this story has touched you as much as it has touched me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this, where we dive deep into the scriptures and extract powerful lessons for our daily lives. Like the video so that more people can be reached by these messages of faith, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's together form a community that seeks divine wisdom and applies these teachings in our lives. God bless and see you in the next video.